Dave Boyle is an expert on collaborative consumption, sharing economy, all this collaborative, cooperative new stuff that's coming up. I'm excited to have him here. We met actually at a great future conference in London, and I asked him to join the advisory board and present here at this conference. The floor is yours, Dave.
Thank you very much. I must first begin by apologising. I'm from the UK, so I should apologise for my government. But hey, it's been like that for 30 years. But I should also apologise because I speak no other languages. I'll let you decide whether I can speak my own language well enough by the end of this. So I'm always humbled when I come to Germany or anywhere else outside the UK where English is not the first language. I'm sure you know this already, but we wouldn't hold a conference in London where everybody spoke German, or indeed any other language, because we're arrogant gits. So apologies for this. I'm humbled by your ability to understand hopefully, what I am saying, and I hope I don't use too many idioms which make it difficult for you to comprehend. My background is not in design. It's not really in many of the things which animate your lives and drive your passions, which is a good way of, I'm sure you're thinking now, why are you here? Which again, we'll leave that question to the end, and hopefully I'll have answered it by then. My background is in helping communities solve the problems they face through collective action. And this is done through a form of crowdfunding which we use in the UK called community shares. It's a specific form of equity crowdfunding where people don't just donate money because they believe in something. They don't just donate more money because they may get a reward. Give us €5, you get a t-shirt. Give us €10, you get a t-shirt and a picture, or this kind of thing. It's where you invest your money and you get to own the project. You get to own the capital flows which result from the project, but on a one-member, one-vote democratic basis. So it's not for everybody. A lot of people in the social entrepreneurship space are uncomfortable about this. But first, a little primer on cooperation. Cooperation, as I understand it, as we say in the UK, has a small c and a capital C. The small c cooperation is what you're doing right now. You're sitting and listening to me. You're obeying a social norm which says it will be rude to start talking to the person next to you. I hope you actually obey that social norm, because it will be uncomfortable for me if I see you chatting or indeed walking out of the room. But I believe cooperation is hardwired into us. And if you look at the person next to you, which I'd just like you to do, just look at them. And what you will be able to do is prove that we were born to cooperate, because you have a little bit of white in your eye. No other primate has this. This means we signal our intentions. Many, many thousands of years ago, if you had a nice piece of food and I didn't, if I'm a gorilla, I can look out of the corner of my eye. My intention is to steal your food, and you don't know, because my eyes are all opaque. Once you introduce the cornea, I can't look at your food without you seeing me looking at your food. So we have to come to an arrangement about how this is going to work. One way to do it is that I kill you. We tried that for many thousands of years. Then we thought maybe there's a better way. We can work together. We can share the food. Maybe you're better at finding food. Maybe I'm better at taking it off the bone. Apologies to vegetarians. But my interest is much more in formal cooperation. Capital C cooperation. Economic cooperation. And it's interesting if you look at this, the historical moment which created the cooperative movement. Like all religions, and cooperation is a form of secular religion. It has its myths, which don't necessarily bear as much relationship to the strict historical truth. But the founding myth of the cooperative movement the stable in which the baby was born and the Magi visited was Rochdale, a small town in the north of England, where I'm actually from, in 1844. 1844 was a terrible time to be a human being. They were called the Hungry Forties. There was a lot of problems with harvests and famines, and a group of people in Rochdale had an idea for a systemic solution which started with flour. People couldn't afford decent flour to make their bread. Like drug dealers would find 125 years later, you can make the product last longer if you adulterate it with similar looking substances which are not the same. So they used to place talcum powder in the flour. So it was poor quality flour and it was expensive. So they decided they had to own the entire supply chain. They couldn't rely on the merchants giving them good flour. So they saved for 18 months. The entry cost was £1, which in modern terms would be around €600, which is a not insignificant amount to essentially very poor people. But they did this because they understood the benefits which would accrue if they did this. And their manifesto is a beautiful document. It starts off by saying the first thing they're going to do is to open a shop which will sell eggs, butter, and flour. The second thing they will do is buy a farm to produce this themselves. They're going to rely on the merchants to begin with, but they will harvest the capital and they will build a farm. The next thing they will do is build a housing community. And the fourth thing they do, and this is the beautiful part, they will reorder the entire economic, social, and cultural operations of the entire human race. It sounds a bit like student Marxists. Today, what will we do tomorrow? We shall take over the world and reorder the affairs of humanity. The amazing thing is, though, they bloody well did it. They actually succeeded. And it wasn't just in the UK. In exactly the same historical moment, 4 years later, the ration system began. Again with flour. Farmers who needed to control the flour they were harvesting and were being penalised by loan sharks. Ration understood, like the Rochdale pioneers, that it was about controlling capital and controlling the flows which grew from that. However, it kind of fell out of fashion in the 20th century. These people were forced to collaborate and forced to innovate because nobody else would. Many of them had been agitators for the right to vote for the government of the day, and for their trouble, they had been shot. Their friends had been killed. They knew they could not rely on the state to provide for them and their families, so they had to do it themselves. They created libraries, they created schools, they created sports facilities. But in the 20th century, when the state developed this provision in many Western societies, these things were lost. The cooperative movement in the UK essentially ceded all of these assets to the state. Ordinary people couldn't really do these things. What you needed was clever technocrats who had gone to the very best universities. Only then could you order the affairs of society more properly. But now is the time for this to be reborn, I would argue, and there's a caveat I must insist upon here. A Canadian cooperative academic did a study about 10 years ago, and he looked at the annual reports of cooperative organisations in Germany, in the UK, in Australia, in the USA, Canada, and he wanted to see what were they saying in 1910. What were they saying in 1920? What were they saying in 1930? What could we read as what were the interests? And he found a strange thing. In every single one of them, the leaders of these cooperative enterprises said, the prospects for the human race have never been darker. But the opportunities and need for cooperation has never been greater. And therefore, the next 10 years will be our decade. Rinse and repeat for 100 years. So we have form at telling ourselves, as Virginia Woolf said, telling lies to each other about how the great cooperative commonwealth is merely round the corner. If we just redouble our efforts, we can achieve it. But I believe that actually, unlike the false dawns, and they all said, unlike the false dawns, so again, take this with a pinch of salt. We're in a similar situation. There's an urgency of a challenge which Ursula has set out, which you all know and you are familiar with. The state is falling away, in some countries a little quicker than others. But the main thing which is changing it is the tools for large-scale collaboration, which the Rochdale pioneers could only dream of, which enable people not just in a specific geographical community to collaborate effectively, but people across the world. The Inner Natives platform. You'll be familiar with so many of them. They suffuse our lives. It's sort of building on the lovely phrase Clay Shirky used in Here Comes Everybody. All of us is smarter than any of us. And this is the insight at the heart of it. The open source movement, which I think we'll be hearing from later, is the classic example. It's not only successful, it's much more successful than any private sector enterprise could have been. Wikipedia has destroyed many businesses in many parts of the world who used to sell reference materials. My problem, though, is that open source, informal, semi-formal collaboration is very good for knowledge products, for the knowledge economy. It's not very good at building bridges and railways. This is one of the challenges. So we can consume, I can buy an electric car, but I can't, the market will not make for me an electric car charging network in order to use that and to make it more adoptable. There are things which need to be done beyond the level of individual consumption, traditionally provided by the state. The state doesn't seem to have as much interest in doing these things at the speed we would like, even in the more enlightened states, which are not run by bastards. It's mentioning no names. But capital allocation, which is at the heart of this, is something the cooperative movement has always instinctively understood from the very inception of its movement. Indeed, before the Rochdale pioneers, the very first cooperative enterprise was actually a collaborative building club in Scotland, the Fenwick Weavers, in 1776. The cooperative movement is very good at taking dates historically significant on a global scale and saying we did something good there too. We even have our own Dr. King who started the whole thing. Crowdfunding now enables this to be done on an incredibly larger scale than has ever been possible. We no longer need the bank to say yes. We no longer need the state to say yes. We can source the finance needed, as was shown in Italy. It starts small, but it started small with the cooperative movement. It was one shop selling 3 products. 50 years later, it bestrode the world. It's combining the small-scale intervention with a grander vision about where this leads, which is the thing cooperation has always been very, very good at doing. It bridges that gap between how do we bring about revolutionary change whilst needing to take small steps in order to get there. The dialectic of reform versus revolution is synthesized on a, sorry, it gives me an enormous pleasure to say a Hegelian term in Germany. I've been wanting to do it for many, many years. One of the examples I like a lot is there's an enterprise in the UK called the Phone Cooperative. A group of people thought, why should the telephone network be owned by big companies who charge us, who don't have very good customer service? So they created their own telephony company. The ability to do this because of telecommunications, change in the technological possibilities of telephone networks gave them this opportunity. But having created an institution which is very, very successful in commercial terms, they don't just want to capture their capital flows, they want to do something more interesting with it. So they're the biggest adopter in the UK of the Fairphone, a device to try and say something which is intrinsic to our lives could be made more sustainable. It's the challenge to the other developers. I could adopt it, you could adopt it. How do we get the network effect where we're all starting to adopt it? Having a cooperative enterprise which can make it the favourable tariff option to thousands and thousands of customers who they also know share the values, which might make them much likelier adopters of the Fairphone, is what's driving the adoption of the Fairphone amongst their customer base. None of the other telecommunications companies are offering this. They don't share those values. If their customers want it, yeah, okay. But they're pushing it because it's what they believe is the right thing to do. Unfortunately, there are many threats, I think, to how we might deploy cooperation to address the challenges we face as a species and a planet. The first is the way in which the sharing economy has migrated from sharing to not actually sharing at all. Sharing is a wonderful thing. I share because I value you as a fellow member of the human race. If I lend you my pen, I don't ask you for 1 cent for the use of my pen for the limited time in which you use it. But the sharing economy has become dominated by what Neil Gorenflo from Shareable calls the Death Stars, Airbnb, Uber, which are not sharing at all. They're ways in which large venture capital funded enterprises can essentially get around one of the problems of growing a large enterprise, which is where do we get the capital to acquire the assets? Simple. Let the other people provide the assets. Become the world's biggest hotel chain without owning a building. Become the world's largest taxi firm without owning a vehicle. But there is something in the sharing economy. Rachel Botsman, who created the concepts of collaborative consumption, was absolutely right. There's that story about the drill. I'm sure you're familiar with it. When people buy an electric drill for their house, it's used for about 32 seconds on average to put up maybe 2 pictures. So why does everybody have a drill? Botsman's absolutely right. That's the sharing economy, where we get smarter about how we utilize some of the products, so we reduce the need to produce them because we've sorted out how to use them more efficiently and effectively. But this isn't the sharing economy which we're being presented with. What we're being presented with is, and I have to say it, it's a very neoliberal vision. It doesn't matter who owns assets. Well, it does. It does matter who owns assets. It does matter who controls the rents which flow from these things, because they're not being reinvested. So Gorenflo says the battle is between what he calls platform co-ops versus the Death Stars. Uber could be a wonderful co-op. All of the drivers could own it. We could own some of it too as consumers. Like with the Rochdale Pioneers, they said profit was an accident of accounting. We charged you too much. Have some of the money back, because it's about sustainability rather than profit accumulation. Maybe we say to you, we're not going to give you all the money back, we're going to hold some back as a reserve to do the next thing we might do together collectively. But I think some of the problems about why platform co-ops will struggle, partly it's money. Uber have $1 billion behind them. You can buy a lot of very good technical designers, UX designers, user interface. I'd never used Uber until I came to Munich this weekend. It's marvelous. They're just bastards. And it annoys me. Why couldn't we do it ourselves? And part of the answer is, if you look at many of the platforms which are developed on more collaborative lines, the user-owned Facebook, the user-owned taxi firm, the user-run hotel firm, there is a problem. They're crap. They don't feel good. We have iPhones which work. Apple's sensibility of making it almost invisible to work through these systems is just missing completely from many of these cooperative ventures. They've just not got enough people throwing themselves at solving the problems, and partly because they don't have enough money. The other problem, though, I think is about sacrifice. Most of these cooperative enterprises, which were built in the 19th century, had at their heart an identity and a linkage between the action which was being proposed and the people who were proposing it. The people who joined the Rochdale Pioneers believed in it and were prepared to sacrifice, because the sacrifice was this: it's not enough to buy food from our shop. You have to stop buying it from the other guy's shop. You have to say, this is how I will consume, and not this way. Because only doing it that way can we grow. The Mondragon Cooperative Corporation, some of you may be familiar with, is a wonderful model of locking in capital. If you work there, you have to take a pension. And the pension has to be with the Mondragon Bank. If you want to get a degree, you will be paid for, but it has to be with the Mondragon University. They don't allow their members, their workers, 100,000 of them, to use their money to fund their enemies. And I say enemies advisedly. It's just that they've made it very clear to their members that their own economic well-being depends on the success of the enterprise, and the enterprise's success depends on them having the resources to grow the company. If you're a farmer in Germany who's joining a Raiffeisen bank, you do that because you've got no alternatives. This is the way in which you will improve the circumstances for you and your family. And I say this I'm not sure I am a millennial. I feel like one, but I'm a bit older, I think. I'm not sure I am. But we're a bit flighty. We flutter from this to that. We don't say, this is who I am. This is what I believe. This is the way in which I'm going to commit to things. We're half in and half out. It's the same when we all make arrangements. Are you free on Tuesday? Maybe. Maybe not. I've not decided whether I'm going to go out with you on Tuesday. I might go with some other friends. We hedge our bets all the time. We don't commit to the sacrifice which is necessary, where you say, I'm going to go in this direction and I'm not going to go in this direction. So that's one of the challenges. The fracturing of our identities, in the main a very good thing, does limit our ability to economically cooperate because there is a degree of sacrifice involved. And so that's, I'd say, the challenge to everybody who thinks that another world might be possible, or even better, knows that another world is necessary. We need better design. We need it to work with the way in which people's expectations are framed by, for want of a better word, the enemies. We need as good design as Apple, which is owned collectively by ourselves. But there is an opportunity. Research in the UK by Nesta, the innovation charity and research centre, looked at the variety of crowdfunding mechanisms and how much money did you get. And the interesting thing, crowdfunding, have some money, make it work, I wish you the very best, gets on average around €60. Capital fundraising gets around 400. A step change. People crowdfund out of the money in their wallet. They invest from the money in their savings accounts. And that's quite significant because across the Western world, we live in an era of historically low interest rates. Money is being held in banks. They're doing things with it, but it's not doing very much for us. And we can deploy that capital more effectively, where social return is as important as financial return. And the final thing I'll just say, I've often used the Margaret Mead quote, which Ursula has stolen my thunder with. But another one which I love is by Arundhati Roy, the Indian writer. I know another world is possible. I can see her, and sometimes I can hear her breathing. And that's what's in face of us. Thank you very much. Thank
Thank you very much, Dave. I think that was a very interesting and inspiring talk, and even not showing any images, but still everybody was listening very closely to what you had to say. Thanks. I would not allow any questions now because we're running out of time. We have to have our coffee break. Please remember all your questions, write them down. We'll have a panel discussion after the whole presentations of the morning, so you can still ask all your questions to all of the presenters of the morning. Okay? Thank you. We'll have a coffee break, 15 minutes. Please be back at 11:15. And as I said, you go out to the, almost leaving the building, turn left, follow the corridor, and you will get to that Bavarian beer house restaurant where we have our coffee. Okay? Thank you.